Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Cedric de Koning. I'm a research fellow with the Norwegian Institute for International Affairs. On behalf of NUPI and the Graduate Institute of Geneva, I would like to welcome you to the second week of the Stockholm Forum and day 6 of the forum so far. You have joined us for a webinar with the topic, Who are the new peace-building actors and what do they want? We have a fantastic panel lined up for you to discuss this question. I'll introduce the panel alphabetically by the countries or the nationalities from which our panel derives from. So we first have Dr. Adriana Abdenur, who is from Brazil. She's a coordinator with the International Peace and Security Division of the Igarapé Institute, and also a member of the United Nations Committee on Development Policy, and she's coming to us from Rio de Janeiro today. We also have Shenyu Johann. She's from China. She's with the Center on Conflict Development and Peacebuilding, doing a PhD currently there at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies, so she's in Geneva. We have Professor Yeshi Shudon, who's with the Center for International Politics, Organization and Disarmament at the Jawaharlal Nehru University. She's coming to us from New Delhi. And then we have Kazushige Kobayashi from Japan. He's also with the Center on Conflict Development and Peacebuilding, where he's doing his postdoc years at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies. And from Moscow, we have Yulia Nikitina. She's an associate professor at the World Politics, and she's also a research fellow with the Center for Post-Soviet Studies at the Moscow State Institute of International Relations. And then we're also honored to be joined by Karl Skau, who's the Deputy Director General of the Department for Conflict and Humanitarian Affairs of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Sweden. So maybe just a few technical things before we get started. I think most of us are used these days now to all the Zoom meetings and the different formats. So more or less, we have the panelists who are able to speak. Our audience, those of you who are connected through webcast, are able to post questions on the chat system, and please do that. And we will come to some of those questions later in the show. So please do comment and pose questions to us. And then we also have a number of people who are joining us via the YouTube channel. So the topic we are talking about today, who are the new peace-building actors and what do they want? I think one of the features of the changing global order that we are all experiencing the transition now of is that there's been the emergence of a number of what we choose to call, and for this session, new peace-building actors. Countries like Brazil, China, Japan, India, Indonesia, Russia, South Africa, Turkey, perhaps many others. So I think one of the questions we will answer, or we will discuss is are any of these actors new actors, so to speak? What do we mean with new? And if they are new, who are the old actors? And if we say they are new peace-building actors, what do we understand with peace-building? I think so. This is probably two of the key issues which we will touch on, and that we will ask our colleagues to try and help to explain how their different countries understand and approach peace-building. What we found in our research is that most of the countries that I mentioned are very familiar with peace-building when it comes to the United Nations and engaging with the Peacebuilding Commission and so forth, but they do not necessarily use the same terminology domestically or in their bilateral foreign relations. So what Charles Cole and I did in a project on this topic that we researched a few years ago, together with several colleagues, some of who are with us now on this panel as well, is we took a very broad approach and we said, okay, these countries may not call what they do peace building, but if they are pursuing a conflict resolution objective through programs or initiatives or mediation and so forth, we will broadly frame it as peace building. that was also reflected in the book we edited on rising powers and peace building with Palgrave Macmillan. So I hope we'll see if you see it the same way and what you think about these questions. That's the aim of our webinar, to discuss together how our different countries understand peace building and what approaches they take towards peace building. So to kick us off, we're going to ask Carl Skau first to tell us a few words about how Sweden sees peace building and why this topic is of interest for the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So Carl, over to you.
Thank you, Cedric, and thank you very much for having orchestrated this panel, for bringing it together, and thanks also to all the panelists for having linked up. We are honored to have you on this panel here from Stockholm. And I think, I should say first that I'm always excited that this actually works, that we have been able to connect so many people from around the world, and it actually works. It really, I think, represents the future, although I hope we're not going to do away completely with also physical meetings. But let me say also, I think this panel really represents the forum in an interesting way. I mean, it's truly global in its composition. It's also dealing with what I would consider frontier issues. It's looking around the corner. And it's also taking peace and security in its broad concept and with peace building. And I think so. I think I really welcome this panel. I will make just a couple of points from more of a personal reflections, really, than an institutional or a Swedish government point of view. I've served in New York almost 10 years, both on the Peacebuilding Commission, including on the Burundi configuration and Liberia configuration, and I've also been on the Council, Security Council, but also been in Zimbabwe, working for the EU there, where I guess you could say there was also somewhat of a peace-building context in the transition years. So what I would first want to say is that, it's clearly clear that we are, that the geopolitical order is in transition. I think that's an obvious starting point, but it's an important one. Something accelerated by 9/11, of course, but then the financial crisis, and now I think the COVID-19 crisis, of course, again will accelerate this, and this triggers many changes. Definitely not only to peace building, but I think that it's clear that it has also changed the context for peace building, and we are seeing more actors perhaps than we've seen in the past. I wouldn't want to call them new actors, because when we talk about Russia and China, of course, they've been on the Security Council for a long time, or since the council was founded. India and Brazil and others have been large troop contributing countries to UN peacekeeping missions. So I wouldn't really say that they are new actors, but maybe they are now starting to use both soft and hard power to also try to influence developments in peace-building context more than perhaps they've done in the past. And I think of, maybe Turkey in Somalia, or India in Afghanistan, Brazil in Haiti, or South Africa in Burundi, perhaps. So I think those are interesting examples. And that is really why Sweden was also such a strong supporter behind the establishment of the Peacebuilding Commission. We realized that, around the table in the Security Council, not all the relevant actors were there who had influence on building peace in specific countries. And we counted ourselves to that group as well, being a huge contributor of development aid and financial support in this context. And so what we really wanted to get with the PBC was to get a broader set of actors supporters ever since. We certainly don't think that we've reached the potential of this commission, but we hope that, moving forward, it will continue to develop and add value and become even more strong and relevant. But as everything in the United Nations, it's only as strong as its member states, if you will, and how we want to contribute. And so it's up to us in a way. And I think here, these new actors have an important role to play. Because when I reflect on their participation in the Commission, I mean, it's clear for us that what we really want is genuine partnership in this Commission. But it hasn't always been easy. And I think that, if there is a commonality, they've all stepped up. I think the commonality somehow maybe stops there because there are clearly very different interests and drivers from the different actors that we discussed today. And I think that these different interests and drivers are often also trumping the peace-building priority. And so when they engage in the PBC, for example, there is always something else that is more important, and hence that's having implications on how they can engage. I think also they have a different understanding of what peace building is, where we often come from a normative perspective, perhaps, often pushing for inclusion, for example, or good governance. Some bring more of a purely economic recovery perspective, whereas others come from a stability agenda. And so I think that there is still this difference of understanding of the concept. But also, and I would end here, and that's that I'm not sure that they all really have come to a conclusion or landed what they really want with peace building from their perspective. I think maybe some countries, China and others, are further along that road in terms of defining their interests in this. But others, I think, are beginning or looking at what this is for them and how they want. And it's clear so far that there are a bit of a different directions as far as I'm concerned. But that's why I'm also excited to listen to this panel, because I might be wrong. Maybe there is a coherent agenda behind this. Maybe they've figured out exactly what they want from this agenda, and hence I'm keen to listen to our panel today. Over to you, Cedric. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Carl, and thank you for starting to already unpack many of the complexities and the nuances in the concept and how they are reflected. So I'm going to turn to Adriana and to Shenyu next to start to give us their perspectives from the perspective of Brazil and China respectively. And so the question to you is quite basic. How would you say Brazil and China understands and approaches peace building? Adriana, can we start with you?
Sure, and I hope that you can hear me well. Hello, everybody from Rio de Janeiro. I want to thank not just CIPRI, but also NUPI and the Graduate Institute for organizing this panel. It's a topic that we cannot let die, as is happening, unfortunately, in some parts of the world. So that's a great question to start off with. And I should start by saying that Brazil is not a new actor at all. It is a founding member of the United Nations, and it also has carried out a lot of bilateral initiatives, although, as Cedric mentioned early on, not always with the language of peace building. But I think that a rationale for the kinds of initiatives that it developed over the decades did arise. Now, one caveat is that when we speak about Brazil at this moment, we're really speaking about a before and after, because there has been a break, not just in terms of domestic policy, but also foreign policy. And that's very starkly reflected in Brazil's current role in what we call very broadly peace building. So who was Brazil before this break? When I'm, of course, referring primarily to the start of an extreme right government here in Brazil. Brazil is a founding member of the United Nations, where from the very inception, the creation of the organization, it stressed multilateralism, peaceful resolution of conflicts, and prevention of conflict through development. It's been a very long time contributor to peacekeeping missions. It's contributed personnel to over 50 missions, as well as key force commander positions, and a very interesting contribution to the Maritime Task Force in UNIFIL. In addition to these contributions, Brazil has also been a normative player, very actively, sometimes even what we call a norms entrepreneur. And in the debates about R2P, Brazil famously stood the ground to some extent against what it saw as excessively self-interested interventionism and the way that the norm of R2P was being used. So it's important to note that Brazil has also been critical of the excessive securitization of the UN's architecture in general, but peace building also. But then Brazil has also insisted on a dichotomy, which I think is now increasingly under tension, between armed conflict and violence or crime, right? And it has always insisted that violence and crime are the purview of the state and not so much an agenda for international cooperation. And I'll come back to this point later on in our debate. But it's important to know that Brazil, like Sweden, was very vocal in the call for reform of the UN architecture, not just the famous story of the UN Security Council, the need for deep reform there, but also in the construction of the Peacebuilding Commission. And I think it's the story of that which is most reflective of the rationale that Brazil has adopted, not only at the UN, but also outside the UN with respect to peace building. And it's a preventive approach that looks to development and long-term initiatives as key, not only to bringing about stability and well-being, but also avoiding the types of highly militarized interventionist approaches that we have seen through the Security Council. Outside UN, Brazil has built South cooperation ties until the break that I mentioned, especially with countries such as Angola, Guinea-Bissau, and others that have long historical and cultural ties. And of course, during the heyday of the BRICS, Brazil joined the other members of the grouping in contesting the norms led by the OECD in terms of trying to harmonize development assistance. And what this meant for Brazil's role in peace building is that it also engaged in conflict-affected settings in ways that the traditional donors didn't always do. Now, just to close my initial statements, I must point out that Brazil's standing in peace building has been deeply affected by at least three factors. First of all, in its bilateral cooperation initiatives, which we can consider as part of its peace building rationale over the last few decades, rampant corruption, especially by construction companies and state actors involved in infrastructure projects, has caused not only tremendous problems, especially here in Latin America, but also has affected the reputation of Brazil as a peace-building actor. And this is even before the rise of an extreme right government. Second, the militarization of public security, not very positive results, and now the militarization of the public sphere in general, also not with very positive results. And the third element, of course, is this shift towards nationalist populism, which, as I said, represents a sharp break. Brazil's foreign policy is now overtly against multilateralism. The foreign minister calls the UN a Marxist globalist policy, and Brazilian actors have doubled down on the discourse of national sovereignty, especially, but not exclusively around the Amazon, has criticized the concept of human rights, has become more pro-interventionist, especially around the case of Venezuela, where Brazil for a time was eager to support US-led ideas for intervention by allowing the use of the Amazon as a corridor for US troops to reach Venezuela. That was eventually shut down. And a deep withdrawal from peacekeeping, which started really under the conservative government of Michel Temer, but has been absolutely consolidated under Bolsonaro due to this anti-multilateralist stance that is at heart deeply contradictory with its previous and historic goals of promoting peace. I think I'll stop here in just 1 second, please.
Thank you very much, Adriana. Xinyu, so let's go to you, and if you could tell us also how you understand how China approaches peace building and how China understands the concept.
Yeah. Thank you, Cedric. Thank you for convening us. And it has really been a great honor for me to share with you a few thoughts of mine on this topic. Is China a new peacebuilding actor? I would say yes, because it was not until the 2000s that China started to pursue a more active role in post-conflict reconstruction. Before then, Chinese assistance was very limited and was largely ideologically driven. After the 2000s, China started to proactively participate in the UN peacekeeping operations, which has now been the pillar of Chinese peacebuilding strategy. Actually, till now, China has been the largest provider of peacekeeping forces among the permanent 5 of the Security Council, and has been the second largest contributor to the UN peacekeeping budget. And that does not include its commitment to regional peacekeeping capacity building programs channeled through the UN Peace and Development Trust Fund that established in 2016 by China, and also through the China-Africa Cooperation Forum established in 2006. Except for peacekeeping, Chinese mediating activities in ongoing conflicts are also on the rise, evidently in the case of Myanmar, Sudan, South Sudan, and Afghanistan, in which China presents itself as a neutral mediator who aims to facilitate political dialogues to reach peace solutions by the involved parties themselves. And more importantly, China insists that peacebuilding should focus on economic development, because China deeply believes that conflicts always arise from poverty and unbalanced development. So sustainable peace is impossible if there is no improvement in economic growth and the basic public goods from the viewpoint of China. Moreover, to deliver that development goal, China actually emphasized on investment in infrastructures such as transportation networks, electricity facilities, and agriculture projects. These are conceived as the essential. So we see that China actually directed massive resources into their infrastructure in its South and South cooperation programs, which normally conducted in the form of turnkey projects. So in short, UN peacekeeping operations, political mediation in some conflicts, and infrastructure-driven economic development. These are 3 major components of current China's peacebuilding strategy. But before concluding, I want to point out that although we have captured these 3-dimensional peacebuilding activities by China, that does not necessarily amount to a coherent Chinese peacebuilding model, because actually in China, the term of peacebuilding is not reflected in the policy framework, and there is no dedicated government agency for peacebuilding. So I think it remains a question whether there has been a Chinese peacebuilding model. That's all from me for now. Thank you, Cedric.
Thank you so much, Shenyu and Adriana. I think from what you've told us so far, it's already very interesting to see how this group of countries will refer to a much broader set of actions like peacekeeping, development type activities, infrastructure, agricultural type projects, which, let's say, some of the more traditional peacebuilding actors in the West wouldn't necessarily frame as peacebuilding. They would think of that maybe as development or as security and so forth. So I think one of the interesting things about how this group of country approaches peacebuilding is that they have a very broader understanding of what is included and not. And we can unpack that a little bit more later. But let's first also hear from our colleagues from India and Russia, Yeshi and Yulia. If we can start with you, Yeshi, how would you say India understands peacebuilding, and what kind of activities does India undertake under the peacebuilding rubric?
Yeah, thank you very much, Cedric. And I'll thank you also inviting me to join this discussion. I would say that India is not a new peace-building actors. India has had a tradition of giving assistance for stabilization and advance peace in the post-colonial states since 1940s onwards, soon after Indian independence. And India does not prefer to use the term peace building. It prefers to use the term peace nation building. Even the UN discussion on peace building, India frequently use the term nation building. So in a sense, there's a difference in terms of terms they use, but I think it's mainly the same thing of helping the fragile states to maintain stability and exercise the sovereign power more effectively. So in that sense, India has been given assistance since late 1940s onwards, soon after Indian independence. Now, even the Indian peacekeepers, India being one of the highest troop contributing countries in peace building, Indian peacekeepings are the early peace builders in a sense that they involve in activities such as in terms of building schools, education facilities, in terms of setting up medical camps or livestock clinics, and other public assistance they have been giving to the local population in the area of deployment of the peacekeeping operations. So in that sense, definitely India is not a new peace builder. In that sense, it's a tradition of assisting the post-colonial states in terms of maintaining the stability and advancing the peace. So, traditionally, India's engagement in nation building activities, supporting nation building activities of the post-colonial state, is driven by political and ideological consideration. Now, why India got involved in this kind of activities? Because India shared the historical, in terms of colonial subjugation, exploitation, and a prolonged freedom struggle with the other developing countries. So India felt the need to express the solidarity with the post-colonial countries by sharing its experiences and resources with the developing countries. We're trying to bring about rapid social economic development to exercise the political sovereignty more effectively. So that's a reason why India was engaged in the nation building activities much before any other countries in the world. In terms of India's approach to the peacebuilding activities, is quite different from the so-called traditional peacebuilding actors, in a sense that India shown a great deal of sensitivity to the sovereignty of the developing countries, and that's why India tend to give assistance only on the request of the independent sovereign states. And once it decides to give assistance, it insists on local ownership and giving the assistance according to the national agenda. And so it clearly gives the agenda setting role to the national government. And it also emphasizes the need for national willingness and commitment to carrying on the national nation building activities. And so that's the reason why India is preferred to adopt a demand-driven approach to the peace nation building activities. And another major unique in terms of India's engagement in nation building activity is that it's emphasized that there should not be any conditionalities. By imposing conditionalities tend to encroach on the sovereignty of independent sovereign states. So India has a tradition of non-conditionalities of its assistance for the nation-building activities of the post-colonial countries. Another major uniqueness is India emphasized, and this kind of assistance is not on the basis of donor-recipient relationship, but in terms of partnership, of mutual sharing and learning from each other. So it insists on in terms of partnership and mutual learning and mutual sharing of the experiences and resources. So in that sense, it adhered to the egalitarian principles of helping each other in terms of mutual gain. And another major in terms of India's approach to nation building activities, that it should be based on the needs of the nation and the felt need of the local population. So it is in a sense that it insists that agenda setting prerogative should be in the national government. So in that sense, the Indian way of carrying out nation building, helping the nation building activities of the developing country is different from the Western way of carrying out so-called peace building activities. Now, in the globalized era, India's, in terms of volume and in terms of diversity, in terms of tools used for giving assistance to the developing countries, has increased and diversified, in a sense that it now adopted in the globalized era, it tend to give more assistance through line of credit system rather than just grants and in terms of loans directly. So in terms of line of credit system, India tend to give subsidies on the interest of the credit they give it to the recipient countries. And in terms of the volume, that's why because of line of credit system, India could increase its volume of financial assistance it could offer to them. In terms of tools, it's diversified in a sense that it's involved, it carry out the assistance in terms of capacity building, transfer of knowledge, and that's one way. And second way is in terms of technical assistance and transfer of technology to the developing countries. And third way of giving assistance is developmental assistance in terms of grants, loans, and line of credit. So in a sense, it diversified not only in tool, but also in the regions. Initially, it used to, most of the assistance were given to the neighborhood countries, but now it's diversified in different parts of the world, gets assistance from India, whoever requested to the India, and right now it's a lot of emphasis on the African states. So at the present time, it's not so much of ideological or political driven approach, but it has more of an orientation towards geopolitical, geostrategic, and geoeconomic dimension as a driver for this kind of assistance. Thank you for the time being.
Thank you very much, Prof. Yeshi. Julia, let's go to you. And how do you understand the way Russia would approach peace building and understands the concept in its foreign policy?
Thank you. Actually, I would agree with a lot that my colleagues have already said on demand-driven approach, or Russia shares this problem with China, that we actually don't have any special term which is reflected in the official documents. So that's pretty much common. What's interesting is that actually Russia in 2017 stopped its funding of the Yuan Peacebuilding Fund. So it was funding, providing support for 10 years, and then suddenly it stopped. So I think it's quite telling. And the official position of Russia is that also the efficiency of peace building within the UN depends very much on the demand from the countries, and that national responsibility and national empowerment are the key issues here. And that sovereignty is, of course, very important. And one very important thing which might be differing Russian approaches, the key idea is that peace is not equal to development and does not guarantee it. So that's why there should be probably different approaches to development and peace. And as to the UN peacebuilding activities, Russian officials usually question the transparency of funding, of how money is spent on different peacebuilding activities. And the criticism of the UN activities are that actually the international community should not impose any ready-to-use recipes to the countries which receive this assistance. And what's more, Russia believes that peacekeeping is not only about the responsibility of the governments, which have to be more resilient, more efficient, but also partially that's the responsibility of the society. So that's why societies need to be empowered in order to assure peace. And a couple of comments that actually, of course, Russia is not a new peace-building actor, and a couple of cases which are very illustrative. So during the Soviet years, in the 1980s, the Soviet Union helped reconstructing Afghanistan, and that's why when Russian officials compare it to the international operation in Afghanistan after 2001, Russian officials are very proud of the Soviet experience, and now they also give the example of the Coordination Center for Reconciliation of Opposing Sides on the territory of the Syrian Arab Republic. So that's also a kind of a peace-building activities, which actually are not called peace-building activities, but nevertheless, the aim is pretty much the same. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yulia. And what for me is very interesting from what all our panelists have been telling us so far is that although perhaps the concept is not something which is so clearly defined, you've all set out a series of norms and approaches that seems to be quite thought out, that gives a specific framework that the different countries employ when they undertake these activities. And another factor that is interesting is how similar this framework is across the different countries, which create this kind of a grouping around this distinction between old and new, if you like, peacebuilding actors. We're going to do an audience poll. I'm going to ask a question to Kazu next, but while he is answering, you will get a poll up on your screen. The question is, do you see the entry of the new peacebuilding actors as a positive or negative development? And it's basically a yes/no answer. And please participate in the poll. And then after Kazu and I spoke, we will have an opportunity to look at your answers. So Kazu, I wanted to come to you because I think Japan is a slightly different actor from maybe the countries that we've discussed up to now. It has perhaps been the closest to the Western developmental model, if you like, member of the OECD and others. But at the same time, Japan has also, I think, maintained quite a distinct identity in its approach. Perhaps one can say an Asian approach to peace building. How would you explain the way that Japan approaches peace building?
Thank you, Cedric. Thank you for organizing this session. I will be very short. Japan's official peacebuilding doctrine, which is mainly developed by JICA, Japan International Cooperation Agency, emphasizes building a resilient state. And for Japan, a resilient state is a strong, functional, capable state, which is able to fulfill basic human needs and to efficiently provide public goods and also to promote socioeconomic development. Japanese peacebuilding policy is also embedded in a larger setting of Japan Development Cooperation Policy, which emphasizes the principles of self-help, self-reliance, national ownership, and the respect for state sovereignty. Also, as you said, Japan has been closely collaborating with Western powers within the setting of OECD DAC. Japan has also been generally treated by Western powers as a kind of maverick or somebody quite different from the West within the OECD. Since the 1960s, for instance, Japan has insisted always that development assistance is about win-win cooperation based on the principles of self-help and national interest. As a part of our research project at the CCDP in Geneva, I have conducted around 30 interviews with Japanese policymakers and peace builders, and the majority of them told me that, very interestingly, that these Japanese ideas of win-win development cooperation, win-win cooperation were never fully accepted by the Western mainstream in OECD. And this was so even in the 1990s when the Japanese ODA was the largest in the entire world. But suddenly in recent years, in the field of peace building, there has been a kind of local turn that people talk about, that respect for local ownership is of paramount importance. While Japan is definitely happy about it, and that's why Japan has been becoming more active in peace building, there's a kind of strange feeling among Japanese policymakers. Japan has been telling you this about local ownership for the last 50 years and nobody listened to us, but suddenly a lot of people are now interested in it. The last point before concluding my remarks, the last point I want to make is that Japan's policy has also influenced other major global powers. For instance, China has been the largest recipient of Japanese ODA, and China has certainly learned a lot from Japanese approach and experiences. Today, Western policymakers tend to criticize China for narrowly focusing on infrastructure development, indebting poor countries with unsustainable loans, and also downplaying governance reforms in the name of no-interference, for instance. But it must be remembered here that these are exactly the same criticisms that Japan used to receive from the Western OECD members in the 1970s and 1980s. Also, in recent years, Japan has been leading multilateral frameworks to promote mutual policy learning in the field of peace building, but also in larger development cooperation. One example is the Northeast Asia Development Cooperation Forum, which promotes a policy dialogue among Russia, China, South Korea, and Japan. Japan believes that it is very important, especially now, to promote this kind of inclusive forum, which bring together different perspectives, approaches, and experiences together so that we can learn from each other. So this is what I need to say about Japan very briefly, but I think that in a similar manner, South Africa has close cooperation with Western powers, but also South Africa has developed closer cooperation with China, Russia, and others in the format of BRICS, for instance. So how does it position itself in the world of peace builders? So this is a question to Cedric. Thank you.
Thank you, Kazu. Well, I think South Africa has probably very similar features to what you have all described. Of course, very active in mediation. South Africa have had a Renaissance fund through which it became involved in various types of humanitarian and developmental type of activities, but also activities like security sector reform and training, for instance, police in South Sudan or in the Congo, which would be very similar to what Western countries would be referring to or thinking of in terms of peace building. But at the same time, not necessarily grouping these various activities under one budget or under one department, under one unit that is coordinating these activities and so forth. And also, I would say a very clear alignment between those countries where South Africa has been very involved in, let's say, mediation, is then typically also the countries where they will be involved in training and peacekeeping and so forth. So a close alignment, I would say, there between diplomatic activities, mediation activities, and broadly what we would term peace-building activities. And I think maybe that's one thing we've also picked up in the research that I referred to earlier, that Chuck Hall and I led, is that across the board, it would appear that in the Western history, in the OECD, in other words, that led the West to define peace building very clearly as something distinct from development assistance, for instance, because it's more political, it engages security actors and so forth, that the countries we've been talking about now and grouping under this kind of new peacebuilding actors framing did not go through that same bureaucratic history and experience. So there is no institutional need in these countries to define peacebuilding as a particular set of activities and to distinguish it from development or mediation or peacekeeping or other sets of activities. So maybe this is one of the reasons why we've seen this distinction. Thank you for that question, Kazu. Let's go to the poll. If we can get the results of the poll up on our screen. The question was, do you see the entry of the new peacebuilding actors as positive or negative? It looks like overwhelming positive, 85% positive. So that's a interesting perspective. Wish we could engage more with our participants, our audience, to find out why they think positive and why they think negative. So we've taken a bit longer than we planned in our first set of questions. So we have about 15 minutes left. I would like each of you to in your closing 2 minutes that you have, to also try to answer some of the questions that have come in. We've had a question, for instance, from Rafael Mareto and from Helen Combas, who both asked a little bit about how do these countries engage with civil society and non-state actors? How is their approach different? What type of approaches do they use? And Francesca D'Antonio also asked, what is the position of these countries when it comes to women, peace and security in your peace-building agenda? So I know these are big questions, but you each only have 2 minutes, please. Let's follow the same order and start with Adriana, please.
Thank you. Those are excellent questions. And here again, we have to draw a distinction between who Brazil was as a peace-building actor and who it is now. What I can say about what Brazil used to do up until 2018 and last year especially was primarily state-to-state, still a part of the Ministry for Foreign Relations, and under a discourse that was very heavily promoted by President Lula specifically, but not exclusively, of solidarity. Now, one criticism that can be made of that discourse is that it connoted solidarity between states and solidarity between governments more than solidarity among people. And this was to some extent reflected in the way that Brazil was carrying peace building, especially on the bilateral and trilateral front that is outside the scope of the United Nations, where some civil society actors would be brought in, but secondary actors, sometimes basically providing some technical assistance, but typically not participating in the larger political and strategic decisions about where to carry out peace building, with whom, and even why. So yes, it was included, but in a very different way, for instance, from what we have seen in the case of India, right, where there is a big diaspora community that's mobilized for that kind of peace building. Now, of course, the military-led extreme right government of Jair Bolsonaro is openly against civil society. There have been several attempts since the beginning of the government last year to criminalize Brazilian civil society. There have been NGOs in the Amazon especially who have had their offices ransacked. And so the relationship between the state and civil society, broadly put, has broken down, and this is also reflected the little bit of peace building by Brazil that remains. And within the UN, of course, one of the problems with the way that the UN has engaged overall with peace building, in my perspective, is the lack of adequate and sustained mechanisms for multi-stakeholder participation. I think this is a very strategic area for conversation, given the 75th anniversary of the UN, and given the need to boost the peace-building architecture. the UN Security Council cannot deal with a broadening scope of topics and regions. The introduction of climate and security is absolutely essential because climate change happens whether or not you believe in it. And unfortunately, Brazil is not heavily engaged with this, but I think that when this dark period is over and we return to a civilian-led, democratic, human rights-based government here in Brazil, there may be an opportunity for Brazil to become a champion of boosting the peace-building architecture in ways that slowly absorb some of the attributes of the Security Council, therefore making the entire peace and security and peace-building architectures of the UN more effective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adriana. Shenyu, can we go to you next? And then I'll go to Yeshi and Julia and Kazu and Carl. So 2 minutes, please. Otherwise, we're going to run out of time. Thank you, Shenyu.
Okay, thank you. This is a very interesting question. Actually, I'm doing my PhD research about the state-society relations in China. Actually, the concept of civil society is understood totally different in China, which means we have the term of government-organized NGOs, which means that these NGOs in the name actually undertake the government responsibilities to help facilitate the government agenda, right? So in the field of peace building, China actually basically is a statist actor who emphasize on the state, the government-to-government interactions. So basically, local civil society actors are excluded from Chinese peace-building activities. And I want to highlight a very interesting thing because, like, I observed that when the UN peace building community is moving to a more active role of youth and women and civil society actors in the agenda, China actually chose to not continue its support for the peace building community, but instead establish a new peacekeeping funding mechanism within the UN system, which is the UN Peace and Development Trust Fund, as I mentioned earlier. So under that trust fund, China can actually move forward its own peace through development agenda without substantially involving local civil society actors. So that's basically it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I must also just say that I think in our last visit to China, there was also a lot of emphasis on people-to-people exchanges, a kind of a new awareness of the importance of that. And so it's maybe not civil society, but it's also an awareness of going beyond the government and developing relations between the peoples of China and whichever country. So that's also an interesting development. Yeshi, let's go to you next, please.
Yeah, in terms of India's assistance to the nation building, it followed the principle of non-interference in internal matters. And that's why Indian assistance does not deal directly with the civil society in the conflict areas. It emphasizes on terms of national ownership and local ownership. And so it's a non-intrusive way of giving assistance and adhering to the kind of respecting the sovereignty without being very intrusive. So that's why India doesn't deal directly with the civil society in the countries transiting from the conflict to peace. Now, in terms of gender or women issue, India is very sensitive about gender mainstreaming, and that's why India has increasingly been sending police women and military women officers in the peacekeeping deployment. And so because of the existence of Indian police women and police military peacekeepers, local women in the area of development get a lot of inspiration and a role model to follow. And similarly, in existence of large number of women police officers and women military officers makes the women in the local community more confident and openly speak and interact about the grievances and about the desire, and that's how their concerns get addressed in the conflict area, in these peacekeeping deployment areas. So it does not follow intrusive policies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before I'm going to go to Yulia, I'm going to quickly throw in another poll. Let's see if we have time for that. So while Yulia and Kazu answers, the question is, do you think the new peacebuilding actors will change the way the United Nations and other multilateral organizations like the World Bank, IMF, etc., view and undertake peacebuilding? So please engage with that audience poll, while Yulia and Kazu also gets a chance to answer the question about civil society and non-state actors and women, peace and security. You each have, maybe if you can do it in 1.5 minutes, that'll be even better. Thank you, Yulia.
Thank you. So Russia sends very few peacekeepers to the UN peacekeeping operations, and out of 74 peacekeepers in 2018, only 8 were women officers, police officers, women. So that's not a perfect balance, gender balance. On NGOs and civil society, I would say that in the 90s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, actually Congo's government-organized NGOs were quite active in peace-building activities and mediation in Eurasia, conflicts like Nagorno-Karabakh or South Ossetia, Abkhazia, and Transnistria. Now, Russian civil society is not that active, but if we take the example of Syria and Russian peacekeeping and peace-building activities in Syria, that's a very interesting case. So actually, this Coordination Center for Reconciliation that I mentioned, those are not trained peacekeepers. Those are military staff, and they do a kind of grassroots mediation with local civil society, with local warlords, and they try to do their best to interact with the population. And I underline it once again, those are not trained staff, but military personnel. So that's an interesting experience, I believe. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yulia. Kazu, Japanese perspective.
Thank you very much. I will be very short. I think Japan's current approach definitely agree with the importance of civil society empowerment and gender equality. But for most part, Japanese policymakers is informed by its own experience of Japan, reconstruction after 1945. As you may know, Japanese constitution after the war was written by Americans. Like Joseph Biden said, 2016, we Americans have written Japanese constitution. It's true. There was very limited civil society engagement. There was almost no engagement of women. And Americans basically did most of the work for us without local ownership, but it worked. And this strange experience, I think, forms the backbone of especially elder generation Japanese policymakers. They have this idea that without civil society, even foreigners coming to give us constitution, it can still work if you manage. And I think in this kind of historical experience, with this kind of experience, it's very difficult to change mindset. But I have also seen a new generation of Japanese policymakers who have different ideas. But definitely the senior officials are informed by Japan's experience that, maybe you don't need to absolutely involve civil society because Japan was reconstructed without so much involvement. So they kind of tend to have this kind of thinking, but I'd say this is also changing in the new context. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kazu. Can we get the answer of the poll up? The question was, do you think the new peacebuilding actors will change the way the United Nations and others, multilateral organizations, view and undertake peacebuilding? It looks like 62% yes, or 37% no. That brings me to Carl. Carl, you've heard our panelists reflect on how the countries they research, view peacebuilding and how they understand and the kind of activities they undertake. Have you got any closing thoughts from your side before?
Maybe just to say, and I don't think that's surprisingly. Yeah, maybe just to say that I think, it's clear from the panel that, the peacebuilding approach is thought through in these respective countries. And it's clear that they're not new peace builders, but they might be in a new fashion. I think what you pointed to as well, that this developmental approach that most of the representatives here are bringing to the table is something that we completely subscribe to. And I think it's something that was just strengthened by our tenure recently on the Security Council, that this is really what is needed. I think the Sahel, for example, is a great example of where there has for many years been an overemphasis on security aspects of the issue. And whereas those are real, what really is needed is more of a developmental approach and an insistence on that. So I think there is scope for close partnership and cooperation between certainly Sweden and these countries. And I hope that there will be those partnerships being built both in the PBC in New York, but more importantly, maybe at the country level. Here, I think often there is an absence of coordination structures where around the table are the more, let's say, traditional donors, but also China, Russia, Brazil were present, and others, and India. And so I hope that is an approach, and that where you have UN resident coordinators in their new function, that they will be conveners of that broader coordination for peace building rather than just OECD DAC countries, which has usually been the case. Over to you, Cedric.
Thank you very much, Carl. Good timing. We're just in injury time. So I'm afraid the only thing I have left to say is to thank our panelists so much for joining us, to thank our audience, to thank the Stockholm Forum. Special word of thanks to the Graduate Institute in Geneva who co-organized this, and especially Kazu, who put a lot of time in. Thank you, everyone, and have a good afternoon or good rest of the day where you are. Thank you. Good evening to you, Prof. Yeshi.